start with a question. What were you doing in 1993? Well, if I think back to what I was doing in 1993, it was probably, I don't know, listening to Nirvana, playing video games and being disappointed watching Aston Villa. If I fast forward now, I've matured, I'm now 40 years old, and what am I doing now that's more productive? Well, I'm listening to Nirvana, playing video games and being disappointed by Aston Villa, but maybe back in 1993 you were doing something more productive, and maybe even someone here may have been taking the first ever legal practice course. So 1993 was the year when there was the last big change in legal education, the LPC. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about the next big change in legal education, which is the introduction of the Solicitors Qualifying Examination, the SQE. Now actually it's a great week to be talking to you about this, because actually the very first assessments are taking place as we speak. They're taking place this week, and around 1,000 odd candidates across several dozen countries around the world are taking the SQE now. So me and my colleague Richard are going to talk to you today about what does this big change mean for law firms. I'm going to be covering a bit off around what the SQE is, a bit of a reminder what the assessment is, and then a little bit about how the market's developing, the training market developing, and how law firms are responding. And then Richard's going to talk about an issue that we know we get a lot of queries on, actually at our stand over that way. The questions we had most about yesterday were qualifying work experience. Now, before I get started, I'd probably also want to make an apology or a clarification, and that is that I'll be using a few acronyms during this presentation, and from the SQE to the LPC to the FLK to QWE might sound like a bad 80s rap, but actually the SQE will be using quite a lot. That's obviously the Solicitors Qualifying Examination, and then QWE is the acronym we'll likely be using for qualifying work experience, and we'll probably be using that quite a bit throughout. So let's remind ourselves, what is the SQE? What's it made up of? And as you can see on the slide there, you've got 4 key parts to the SQE. So firstly, to qualify under the SQE, you need a degree or an equivalent. That degree doesn't have to be a law degree, it can be any university degree. What do we mean by equivalent? Well, it could be a number of things, but it's most likely to be something like an apprenticeship. Then in the second part of the jigsaw, you'll see qualifying work experience. You need to get 2 years experience working in a law firm, and Rich is going to cover that in a bit. Thirdly, you need to pass the SQE assessments. There's SQE 1 and there's SQE 2, and I'm going to talk about what that covers in a bit. And then finally, you need to meet our character and suitability requirements. I'm not going to dwell on that, but that's the requirements. We do checks to make sure perhaps you haven't got a criminal record or some things in your past that, for instance, around maybe mishandling money, or that might suggest dishonesty, that might be an issue that might not make you suitable to qualify. So that is the 4 parts of the SQE. We've deliberately put those in a jigsaw there because actually you don't need to do those in any particular order. The only thing on that slide that you would need to do in an order is you need to complete SQE 1 assessment before you can go on to take SQE 2 assessment. But you can do those things in different orders. Saying that, there probably will be fairly typical or common orders for people, and a typical order for people might be that they do a degree, maybe they do a law degree, they then might take SQE 1, they might do a little bit of training for that. If they pass that, they might then get their 2 years qualifying work experience. They then hopefully maybe will pass SQE 2, and if they pass the suitability requirements, they'll then qualify. So that might be a typical route. So when does the SQE come into effect? Well, effectively, the regulations were laid down in September, so it has already come into effect. But obviously, what we wanted to avoid was anyone who started training under the old route, the LPC route. We didn't want anyone to be left high and dry, having started to train under one route and then having to transfer for the SQE. So there is sort of a transitional period. So if you've started to train under the old LPC route, you have a choice as to whether you carry on through the LPC route, or you might decide that actually, no, I want to qualify through the SQE. What's the cut-off? Well, effectively, if you started training, if perhaps you started a qualifying law degree, you're doing a law conversion, or you've got a training contract, if you started that in September, you've got a choice to go either way. However, if you've started after then you'll have to do the SQE, or if you haven't started by then. There is a bit of nuance to the regulations in that area, so if that really matters to you, I'd strongly encourage you to go off and have a look at our website to make sure you understand the guidance and what applies for you. But what does this mean? I suppose it means that immediately firms will need to think that they're going to be operating in a world where there'll be some people who'll be qualifying through the LPC, and there'll be some people who'll be qualifying through the SQE. And with time, there'll be more and more people who are qualifying or can only qualify through the SQE route. So you're going to have to think about how you're going to manage that. So let's move on to what the assessment covers. So as I said, there's 2 SQE assessments, and the first one is SQE1, and that covers what's called functioning legal knowledge, or if we go back to our acronyms, you may hear it referred to as FLK. So that's the exams that are happening this week, and it's made up of 2 180 question assessments that last for around 10 hours in total. And what those assessments are about, it's not about regurgitating legal knowledge or just testing whether you know the law. It's testing your ability of can you identify the legal principles and knowledge and then apply them to client problems and client situations where there's a legal problem. So that's what functioning legal knowledge means. So it's about sort of practically applying that knowledge. Another thing to say about that is, if I move on to the next slide, you'll see the areas of law that are covered in the first SQE1 assessment. It's not too dissimilar to what is covered in the old system. But I suppose one point to add to that, and I'm not going to run through everything that's on the slide there, but ethics will be tested throughout. So there isn't an ethics section. Ethical problems will emerge or will be sort of laced throughout the exam, and candidates will have to identify whether they can spot an ethical problem. So there might be a situation where there might be a conflict of interest, or a solicitor may not be able to act independently. So candidates will need to spot that, and the reason they need to spot that is, in practice, ethical problems or dilemmas don't sort of arrive with a flag saying I'm an ethical dilemma. In practice, you need to spot them, so likewise you'll need to spot them in the exam. So if you pass SQE1, which is the functioning legal knowledge assessment, you can then move on to SQE2, and that is going to test the combination of, again, functioning legal knowledge, but then it's also going to test practical legal skills. There's 16 tasks within there, which are a combination of written and oral tasks, and it's the types of tasks that you would carry out as a solicitor in practice. So here is a list of the 6 skills that are assessed. Some of them are, let's call it, more sort of harder skills like legal research or legal writing, but then there are also softer skills which will be tested orally, such as client interviewing and advocacy. As well as testing those 6 skills areas, you'll also be tested across 5 legal contexts. So that's where you need to have the sort of functioning legal knowledge to apply those skills in those different scenarios, whether that's criminal litigation or business organisation rules. Now, you should have picked up that knowledge when you did SQE1, but you need to be able to apply that in SQE2. So that's a broad summary of sort of what the SQE assessment covers. So how are things shaping up in terms of how firms are responding to that and sort of how the training market's developing? So shall we start with how firms are responding? Some firms are jumping straight in and sort of moving towards taking on SQE candidates straight away. Other firms are perhaps thinking, let's take a more gradual approach. But we have, if you're interested, a list of case studies on our website. If you have a look on our website, the SRA's website, if you Google sort of hashtag SQE ready, you can find case studies of how some firms are already responding. And I'll pick out 2 or 3 of those that you might find helpful. So firstly, you've got the City Consortium, which are a group of 6 sort of big city firms. They're going to be taking on their first SQE candidates next year, and they've teamed up with a training provider who's going to provide training to get their trainees sort of geared up to take SQE 1 and SQE 2. But what they've done is, because they're city firms, they've said actually commercial legal knowledge is really important for us. So with that training provider, they've developed training which will add on sort of extra commercial law elements. And that's one of the things with the SQE we always say to firms is, we're giving you quite a bit of flexibility around how you want to train your trainees and what's relevant for your business. If you take another business, there's a far smaller law firm called Level, who sort of specialises in sort of culture, media, sports law, and they're taking on SQE candidates on a 30-month programme that they've set out. And actually what they've said is they want to make that very hands-on, so their trainees are going to do 4 days in the office and then 1 day sort of in the classroom training for SQE. Now, another area where we've already seen quite a lot of movement, and I think is definitely something that perhaps if you might want to consider as a law firm, is on the topic of apprenticeships. As you may know, lots of businesses pay an apprenticeship levy, and that apprenticeship levy can be used by any business, whether you pay the apprenticeship levy or not, to take on solicitor apprenticeships. And what that means is you can get the funding paid for to train those apprentices, and you can pretty much get nearly all the funding to cover that training. I think it's up to 95% of the training cost of an apprentice. So that's quite an appealing option for firms, because actually obviously there's quite a big financial benefit in getting the training covered, and there's quite a lot of firms who are already doing that. From smaller firms like Wright Bailey right through to bigger firms like Gowling and BCLP, and we're getting quite good feedback on that process. If you're really interested in the apprenticeship route, I'd give a shout out to there's some quite interesting webinars targeted at firms around the practicalities of how you go about setting up an apprenticeship. And if you can face hearing from me again, because I'm chairing that, you can hear from firms about how they've gone about it. So I'd recommend that if you're interested. But there's 2 types of apprenticeships, and 2 types of apprenticeships we're seeing firms sort of carrying out. Firstly, there's 6-year apprenticeships, and those are for people who haven't done a degree. They might be school leavers, or they might actually be a more sort of mature candidate who, for whatever reason, hasn't done a degree. So that's a 6-year programme, and we're hearing really positive feedback in terms of the benefits of that. Not only there's the financial benefit of covering the training, but secondly, we're hearing that actually it can be a really good way to tap into new diverse talent, to tap into new type of talent that might not traditionally go to university. Secondly, we're hearing that there's business benefits. So firms are telling us that within 6 months or so, apprentices are already doing work that's benefiting the bottom line. And then thirdly, by taking on apprentices, we're hearing from firms that you're getting a sense of sort of loyalty from those candidates, and they're understanding your firm culture, which is another benefit. So one alternative to taking on solicitor apprenticeships is there are also graduate solicitor apprenticeships. And rather than the 6 years of the other apprenticeship, you can run a graduate apprenticeship in about 2.5 years for qualification doing the SQE. And we're seeing quite a lot of law firms and businesses exploring that option. So you've got firms such as Kennedy's running graduate apprenticeships. The BBC has launched its own in-house graduate apprenticeships. And then some of the big accountancy firms who are taking on solicitors, such as KPMG and Deloitte, are also taking on graduate apprenticeships who will do the SQE. Again, that might be something you want to consider. So that's a bit about how law firms are responding to the SQE and other businesses. What about how the training market's developing? Well, one of the reasons we brought in the SQE is one thing we wanted to see was a diverse training market that gave people choices. And it's early days, but I think the initial signs have been pretty positive. There's around 12 training providers who are already providing training on the SQE, and you're seeing quite a variety of options there. So there's online options, there's face-to-face options, there's top-up courses, which are quite sort of quick and I don't want to say cheap, but quite low cost, which might be suitable for someone who's already got quite a lot of legal knowledge, who maybe wants to prepare for the SQE. But then at the other end of the spectrum, there's training providers providing SQE training courses with master's degrees on top of that, which provide quite a lot more variety and go further than just is required for the SQE. I think the good news is, though, that actually there's a lot of training courses out there which would allow people to qualify in a more affordable way than in the old LPC system, where you paid up to £17,000 to do an LPC, and potentially with no guarantee of a training contract at the end of that. So some people just got sort of stuck after taking that gamble. And Richard will go on to talk about how qualifying work experience potentially maybe addresses that problem. But there's a lot of courses out there that if you self-funded yourself to do the SQE, you could qualify with the cost of the exams and the cost of the training for £10,000 or less. That is still a lot of money, obviously, although there is the potential to spread that out, and quite a few earn as you learn options to fund that as you go along. And as I've also discussed, there are other options such as apprenticeships, which mean you can reduce the cost even further. So I think the signs in the training market are pretty positive, but we'll need to see how that pans out. One final thing to say about the training market is we're pleased to see a couple of universities have just announced training courses which will, or degrees, which will incorporate SQE1 training. And that's a good thing, we think, because again, a candidate could have the choice to do an SQE law degree, again, which maybe enable them to reduce their costs and also potentially get through to qualification more quickly if they know they definitely want to be a solicitor. So I'm just going to say a couple of final things before handing over to Richard in terms of what this means for firms. There are some questions you need to ask yourself in terms of what the training market's out there. So if you're thinking of taking on candidates, or you're thinking of taking on trainees, do you want to take people on who have passed SQE1? What are you going to tell them about training for SQE2? Are you going to offer training in-house for that? Are you going to work with a training provider to provide that training? Or are you going to tell people, actually, you can come and work at our firm, but actually you need to organise your own training for SQE2 if that's what you want to do? So you'll probably want to be thinking about these things. Also, as you can see on the slide, we do think the SQE provides a far better guarantee of standards, not a far better, but a better guarantee of standards than the current system or the old system. And that's because in the old system you had more than 2,000 firms signing off whether a solicitor or a trainee was competent after their training contract, but you also had more than 100 universities and training providers setting and marking exams for trainees. With all the best will in the world, there's a risk of some inconsistency there. The SQE means with one single rigorous assessment, everyone will know that if someone has passed the SQE, that they've met the same high standard as the next candidate to come along who's also passed the SQE. We think that's good for firms because they can have more confidence that someone has met that standard. But also there's some quite interesting stuff in terms of recruitment for firms. And I think over time, we do manage to publish data around how candidates perform. And that should be helpful for firms in terms of their recruitment. Because what you can do is you can have a candidate come to you, you can find out what their mark was on SQE1, and you compare like for like how people have performed. But by using that data, you can also try and look for, has that candidate done exceptionally well potentially for the background they're from? So perhaps if they've come from a background where they've perhaps not gone to sort of a traditional university that does so well, or a school that does so well, but they performed exceptionally in the SQE, you can potentially identify a really talented candidate compared to other people who may have had a similar background. So we think that could be useful in terms of firms finding the best talent for their business. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to talk about perhaps I think the most relevant thing in terms of firms and the biggest change, which is qualifying work experience, or QWE. So thank you, Richard. Well, thank you for the person who applauded me. I'll take that.
Obviously a very hard act to follow now. But I wanted to talk about qualifying work experience. And as Ben said at the very beginning, it's by far the largest area where we're getting lots of queries about. So if you do have questions about qualifying work experience, firstly, you're not alone. And secondly, hopefully over the next 10, 15 minutes and maybe after, you will be able to get those answers to those questions. But before I kind of dig into some of the slides, I think it's worth taking a slight step back and reminding ourselves as to why we introduced qualifying work experience. Now, the purpose of qualifying work experience is to give intending solicitors a process of, I suppose, socialisation to the kind of behaviours, knowledge and skills required for effective and competent practice. It's also about giving them an opportunity to see how those skills and behaviours happen in a workplace, because those, as Ben has explained, will be assessed in the SQE. And thirdly, and Ben did touch on it, you know, the training contract creates barriers to admission. It's prescriptive, it's restrictive, and actually qualifying work experience has more flexibility, and that helps reduce those barriers and enables us to be a bit more kind of open in how we support diversity to the profession. Okay, so having fun with the slides. I'll crack on to this slide. So in terms of kind of the fundamental pillars of what qualifying work experience is, as you can see on the slides there, it's any experience of providing legal services that enables an individual to have exposure to some or all of the competencies outlined in our statement of solicitor competence. Now, we are not going to describe for you or tell you what legal services looks like in your context. You know, there's so many organisations that are offering qualifying work experience, so many different types of firms. However, if you are thinking whether the work that a particular role or the function of a particular role, whether that qualifies as qualifying work experience, a really good starting point is the way in which provision of legal services are described in the Legal Services Act. Now, if you take a look at that and think, actually, this role or function sits within that definition and it engages some or all of the competencies, then you're likely to be on a strong footing that work or role or function is in fact qualifying work experience. As you can see on the slide there, you know, qualifying work experience can be attained here, abroad, in regulated, in unregulated organisations, and really that's about us being as flexible as we can in supporting diversity to the profession. You can see on the slide there, and as Ben has mentioned, you know, it must be at least 2 years or a part-time equivalent. Now, we're not going to prescribe what that is. And the reason we don't want to prescribe why that is because actually that introduces prescription where we don't need it. And actually, you guys as firms or organisations, law clinics, kind of in-house departments, you'll have your own equations and algorithms to work out what full-time and part-time works. So, you know, you use those, you know, and be comfortable in using those. And actually be pragmatic as well, you know, by 2 years, you know, we're not expecting that it is exactly 2 years. If you have someone working with you who's had a 3-day city break somewhere nice, you know, they don't have to add on an extra 3 days to calculate, you know, kind of 2 years. You can be pragmatic about this. You can obtain qualifying work experience in up to sort of four organisations, and again, that is about being flexibility. You don't have to be tied down to one organisation. You can kind of move around a little bit, get exposure to competencies from lots of different organisations, delivering legal services in lots of different settings. So, in terms of benefits for law firms, you know, I think the key benefit for law firms here is about flexibility and freedom. It's about flexibility for you to consider and think about how you want to align your training, and how you want to align your kind of career progression and development pathways to meet the needs of your business. You know, you have scope to do that now. It's also about you thinking about, you know, how you enable individuals to gain exposure to some of the competencies. You know, there's much more flexibility for kind of learning by doing. There's much more flexibility to partner up with other firms and work collaboratively to give them and individuals that you might be employing exposure to kind of competencies in different circumstances. And a key benefit, I think, is actually how you position yourselves as law firms now. What is it about your qualifying work experience offering that is your unique selling point? You know, what competencies do you expose individuals to? what does that look like? And how can you use that to sell yourself and attract different types and high caliber candidates? I'm going to try and move the next slide on without going back to the previous one, which is something I seem to be struggling with quite a lot. So let's see. Excellent, I've passed. A key aspect of qualifying work experience where we get an awful lot of queries is, what does confirmation look like in practice? You know, what am I confirming? Who's doing it? You know, will the SRA come in and take action against me if I do something that is terribly wrong? And I want to spend the next couple of slides just clarifying that. So in terms of the who, we're saying that it can be a solicitor or a compliance officer for legal practice who can confirm qualifying work experience. And they can be in the organisation where the actual placement is happening. That solicitor or COLP doesn't necessarily have to have a practicing certificate though. They can be on the roll. But in terms of flexibility, which I've talked a lot about, and the places where qualifying work experience can be attained, it doesn't have to be in a traditional law firm. It can be in law clinics, in-house departments, for example. Now, those organisations, by and large, may not have a solicitor working with them. So in order for that qualifying work experience to count, we've said that a solicitor that's working outside of that organisation can confirm it, subject to the caveats you can see on the screen there. So hopefully that gives you a sense of who's doing the confirming. In terms of what is being confirmed, now I think it's probably indicative of the solicitor's profession that people want to know exactly what they're signing their name against. And again, this is an area that causes confusion and concern. So I'm going to just unpick a little bit of this. So what the individual is doing is confirming whether a person has had exposure to some or all of the competencies. I can categorically say now, confirming qualifying work experience is not about you as a solicitor or a COLP making any subjective assessment of whether that individual is competent to practice as a solicitor. And obviously that's a shift away from some of the previous mechanisms that Ben has described. The role and the function of determining whether an individual is competent lies with us as the regulator, and we deliver that through our regulatory control, which is the SQE. So, hopefully that sort of clarifies and kind of gives you comfort that actually, you're not determining whether someone is fit to practice, essentially. And to some extent, what that then leaves qualifying work experience and confirmation of qualifying work experience being is actually quite a mechanical and factual confirmation. What you are in fact confirming is what the details of the placement. For example, did Richard Williams work at Ben Fisher for the period that he has stated? And lots of you will have systems in place already, HR systems to enable you to confirm that. It's all about as well whether, kind of, as I've said, an individual has had some exposure to all of the competencies, and again that's based on the evidence that you're presented. And again, as I said, you're not making any kind of assessments of the quality of that experience either. It's very factual. And finally, you're making you're giving us information and confirming whether or not there have been any character and suitability issues. And again, we're not asking you to determine whether an individual has the right character and suitability to enter the profession. We have that, and that's what the character and suitability requirements, going back to Ben's jigsaw, are designed to pick up. Now, given what I've described, and given that kind of factual nature and quite mechanical nature of confirmation, our starting position is that if there's any qualifying work experience that meets those criteria, the default position of a solicitor or COLP should be that, to confirm that qualifying work experience. There should be quite, not particularly too many grey areas in there that might cause some confusion. And again, just a reminder that as a solicitor or COLP, you have kind of overarching regulatory obligations around acting with kind of honesty and with integrity, which kind of underpin that confirmation process. So hopefully that kind of explains what kind of confirmation looks like and feels like in practice. We recognise that lots of different organisations are at kind of different points on their journey towards implementing the SQE, and different points and journeys in thinking about qualifying work experience. So I've pulled out a number of things on the screen there which you might find helpful. They might raise further questions for you, but at least in knowing them, you're on the right sort of track, and you're giving it sort of full consideration. So one key thing to think about is, how is the kind of process of confirmation going to work within your organisation? And again, you can make that bespoke to how it works for you. We're not going to prescribe how it works, because there are a multitude of firms operating in different ways. But what you might want to think about is that going to be kind of centralised within an HR function, for example, going back to some of the items that need to be confirmed, or will it be kind of localised at a team level? So there's some things for you to think about there. Qualifying work experience can be claimed retrospectively. So you could have an employee who's worked for you 5-6 years ago who comes back and say, in this role I had exposure to these competencies, I'd really like you to sign off my qualifying work experience. How's that going to work for you? What systems and processes do you need in place? And a key consideration here is, how does that align to your kind of employment data retention policy? There will be a cut-off point at which point anyone coming back further than your data retention policy, you're probably not going to be able to confirm those records. So how are you going to explain that to people, for example? How will recording qualifying work experience look like as well? It's very much based about the evidence. How has an individual met some or all of the competencies? What have they done to do that? And how are you going to obtain your assurances as a solicitor or CULP confirming qualifying work experience? How are you going to do that? Again, you've probably got systems and processes recording the performance of individuals. We've got a template on our website that is really worth having a look at if you're kind of thinking about starting off what that might, you're thinking around that. Again, absolutely crucial, I think, to a lot of this is, how are you going to manage employee expectations? There will be people perhaps working in your firm, perhaps as paralegals, who are seeing the SQE and qualifying work experience as an opportunity to become a solicitor. You may not want them to become a solicitor. There may not be roles for them. Your business model may not support that. How are you going to have those conversations with them? They're likely to be difficult, but you need to be kind of open, transparent with individuals about what you're planning to do and how their kind of career pathway fits within your kind of structure. And the final point there is, again, how can you take advantage of the flexibility about recruitment? We've issued guidance on what good qualifying work experience looks like as well, and I just want to kind of clarify, that's not kind of regulatory guidance. You don't have to comply with that guidance, but it's there really to serve as a support mechanism for you to think about how you can maximise the advantages that qualifying work experience and the SQE more broadly gives you. So I just want to quickly talk through a couple of the points on that slide. Firstly, if we go right back to the beginning of my talk here, it's about socialisation. It's about giving people kind of exposure to the practice, the skills and the skills that will be assessed. So by virtue, that might mean how can you as an employee, if you want to support people, give them access to a diverse and varied workload that gives them more exposure to competencies. What does that look and what does that feel like in your firm? And again, in terms of opportunities for kind of reflection, you'll probably already have systems and processes in place to enable you to do that. But we think good qualifying work experience gives an opportunity for the individual and the firm to kind of take stock at various points and say, how am I progressing? Am I meeting the competencies that I thought I would or I need? And if not, how can I address those? As Ben said, ethics, professionalism, it's assessed pervasively throughout the SQE. So what does qualifying work experience look like in your organisation in relation to those two aspects? And finally, and again, this comes back to a law firm's overarching kind of responsibilities, how is an individual going to be supervised on their qualifying work experience placement? Again, what kind of systems and processes have you got in place to make sure that that's working as it should? So hopefully, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through qualifying work experience. probably plenty more to discuss in the Q&A section, but I just wanted to end on another plug for our resources. There are comprehensive resources about the SQE and qualifying work experience on our website. And again, picking up Ben's point, if you can't get enough of me and Ben as a double act, there's at least 5 webinars about qualifying work experience, really drilling down into some of the kind of key aspects and key questions. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those. So I think that's kind of wrapped up Ben and I's presentation, and probably open to questions now, I would imagine, Ben.
Does anyone have any questions? Raise your hand if you do. We've got a woman at the back, and then we've got someone over there afterwards.
Hi, my name is Andrea. My question is if this qualifying work experience can be done, cumulated from 2 or 3 different firms, or working with 2 or 3 solicitors.
Simple answers, yes, but do you want to?
That's absolutely right. It can be obtained in up to 4 organisations, so you have plenty of opportunity to maximise your experience.
I suppose the thing to add to that is that might entail 3 or 4 different solicitors signing off those different chunks of qualifying work experience. So if you were doing that, you'd probably want to identify right at the start of a new placement who was going to be confirming your qualifying work experience. I had a question at the back there, yeah?
My name is Louisa Nkokwa. Must it be a paid employment, or can someone organize to do it on a voluntary basis, say the first 6 months? Because there are some people who say, I know you can't pay me, but I'm willing to learn. So how do you position that?
The short answer to that is yes. It doesn't have to be in paid employment. It can be through voluntary work, so long as that voluntary work is providing legal services and exposes you to some or all of the competencies in the statement of solicitor competence, then you can count that as qualifying work experience, so long as it's signed off by a solicitor or comp as well.
My name is Athanasius. Everyone knows that legal profession, from my own experience, it's not what you just come up in the middle. I want to be a lawyer. You must have thought it out. I want to be a lawyer. And the old system of LPC surely says that, provides that this person must have thought it out, that I want to be a lawyer. And the funny thing then, or still now, is after the LPC, people don't get training contract. Why is it that SRA cannot make it lighter for firms to train people than leaving people on the street untrained? And now they have brought again the SQE, which I believe is going to be in the same way of people taking the people they want to take, firms taking people they want to take, training whom they want to train, and by the end of the day, you face another exam, which I believe also people will be failing, keeping them where they are. So, what difference has this this SQE made compared to the former LPC routes?
Shall I have a go at answering that first, and then thank you. There's quite a few points there, I think, to pick up. So let's first pick up what the problem with the LPC system was, which I think, and then I'll move on to say how I think the SQE is going to solve that, or make it better. So the problem with the LPC, as you rightly said, was people would often have to, if they got a training contract, good for them, and they potentially get their training paid for, and then they go on to qualify as a solicitor. However, we know lots of people don't get a training contract. They then have to gamble money up front on the LPC, up to £17,000, and that's a pretty big gamble. And even then, after they've done the LPC, they still can't get a training contract. And that might be for reasons such as they have caring responsibilities, they happen to live in a part of the country where there's not many firms offering that type of stuff, or their face doesn't fit in interviews. We don't think they're necessarily, those aren't good reasons as to whether someone is competent enough to qualify. So we think that the old LPC system, there was a barrier there to entry. On top of that, you also had the risk of inconsistency. So you had 2,000 firms who had to sign off whether someone was competent through the training contract. But there's always a risk. Do 2,000 firms or training principals think alike? There's a risk of inconsistency there. So I suppose the nub of your question though is, well, is the SQE going to make that any better? Firstly, I suppose the thing to say is, we as the regulator don't think anyone should qualify as a solicitor unless they're good enough to be a solicitor. We're here to protect the public, we're here to maintain trust in the profession, that you know that if someone is qualified as a solicitor, they've met a certain standard, and that's really important. We think the SQE, by having a consistent examination that is the same for everyone, is the best way to give people that reassurance. However, the risk of people who are good not being able to get a training contract, or not being able, I think you described it as being sort of left on the streets, unable to qualify, we think that is reduced, because what we're saying is, under the current or the old system, you had 2,000 firms who could provide training contracts. Under the new system, any business can provide qualifying work experience. So that includes in-house, that includes small firms, large firms, medium-sized firms. That includes actually even, you could work in an unregulated business that's providing legal advice, as long as it can be signed off by a solicitor or a compliance officer. We think that reduces the barrier for someone who's good enough, who can pass the SQE exams, in order for them to get the 2 years experience they think they need to qualify. So we think that's good for candidates, but we also think that's fairer, because if someone's good enough, why should the barrier of whether they can get a training contract decide whether they could qualify or not? And we also know a lot of people, particularly if you've perhaps from a less wealthy background, the idea of gambling that amount of money up front on training and then not being able to qualify just puts people off even trying to apply at all. And you also sometimes get the situation of people being stuck as a paralegal for years and years and years, with the golden ticket of a training contract sort of there, like, oh, you may get a training contract, but sometimes that training contract never comes, and we don't think that was particularly fair either. So I don't know whether that addresses or answers your question, but I've tried to give a run through of the logic of the change we've made. If you want to come back, please come back. You're nodding your head, so I'll take that as a good sign. All right, thank you. Do we have any more questions? I've probably got a couple of questions for you, Richard, if we don't have any more questions. I suppose quickfire. One quickfire I wanted to, it's probably worth clarifying. Is this the death of the training contract?
In a way, the prescription of the training contract will go as part of qualifying work experience. But actually, you know, we're not prescribing what qualifying work experience kind of looks like and the form that it should take, subject to the kind of the criteria that need to be signed off. So, you know, firms can make a decision really. You know, if they want to carry on with a period of 2 years that looks and feels like their existing training contract, that's for them. That's for them to decide. Or if they want to kind of take advantage of some of the benefits and flexibilities we've talked about, they can consider that. So, you know, we won't require as, you know, for admission that an individual has done a period of recognised training. So
which is the training contract.
Which is the training contract. So, you know, it's really in the hands of firms to think about what works best for them.
So effectively, training contracts still exist as doesn't exist as a regulatory requirement anymore, but actually, in reality, they'll still be training contracts. Yeah. We've got a question here and then a question there.
Hi there.
Hi.
If a candidate has gone down the traditional LPC route thus far, can they now take advantage of the QWE, or do they still have to have an old-fashioned training contract if they've done the LPC?
I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah,
So actually, it's interesting. So if you've done the LPC, but you haven't got a training contract, that's what we see where some people get stuck. And the SQE is quite an interesting option for those candidates, because they can decide to go down the training contract. They can decide to go down the SQE route. And what we've said about the SQE is that if they've done the LPC, they just need to pass SQE2, which tests the legal skills and sort of combined with the legal knowledge element. They wouldn't need to pass SQE1. So they could decide that if they want to go down that route, they could sort of switch to trying to qualify through the SQE. And the advantage that they would have is, if they'd already got 2 years qualifying work experience, because for instance they might have worked as a paralegal, they then wouldn't have to get that training contract anymore. Or they could still go after the training contract and qualify if they can get that. Thank you. there was a question, I think the gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you so much. I had the same question to ask, so I got the answer.
Okay, so you great minds think alike then, so thank you. Are there any more questions? We've got a question again at the back.
Sorry, I have another question. If someone is already qualified in, for example, New York jurisdiction, how can they get qualified in the UK?
Do you want to answer about what these are qualified lawyers, or do you want me to begin?
I can answer from a qualifying work experience perspective, and they wouldn't need to satisfy the qualifying work experience requirement. But perhaps Ben, you want to pick up the rest?
So what I'd recommend is, so there are potential exemptions for qualified lawyers who have qualified abroad. Go onto the SRA website and you can see which lawyers get exemptions. So for instance, lawyers who have trained in Ireland or Northern Ireland, I think, get a total
correct,
exemption. Whereas we've announced partial exemptions just, I think, in the last few weeks for lawyers from Denmark and Hong Kong. And what we're doing is we're looking at all the various jurisdictions, mapping what we think is required to qualify as a lawyer in England and Wales, and mapping across to see whether that matches the criterion in other countries. So go on, have a look at the qualified lawyers section of our website. But yeah, it might be the case that you may be able to get exemptions. We're just going to finish off now because
Hello.
I think there's...
Yeah, just one question.
Oh, sorry, there is one question,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, sorry, I apologize. Thing is that if somebody might have really completed the BBC or bar, in that case, then if I wish to really transfer my BBC towards the SQE route, so is there any exemption route? Or imagine that in one scenario I have experience of working with a solicitor firm for 5-7 years. In another scenario, probably I don't have any other experience, but I'm doing another job or the business. But I need to come back to the SQE route. So what sort of exemption probably I can think about it? Thank you.
So this is if you've trained at the bar, again, I can't remember the specific details actually, but the qualifying work experience you could bank, so that wouldn't be an issue. And I think there may be potential exemptions, but excuse me, I can't remember exactly what they are in terms of, or whether that's been confirmed yet. So, you could go and look in our website under the qualified lawyers section, and it will set out the latest position.
But would not be the unreasonable that this if the part 1 at least should be exempted, like the people, those who have completed the LPC, if they can really get the exemption of another part 1, and they can go for the part 2. But those who have really completed the bar, I think to a certain extent it would be reasonable to give them exemption from the part 1 at least. I don't know.
And I'm not saying that's not the case. I just can't remember off the top of my head what we've said about that. But yes, no, it's a good point.
Thank you.
I was being given a signal from the back, I think, to say that we're getting towards the end of our time. But me and Richard are both going to be around immediately after if anyone wants to have a chat with us about any of this. And as I say, thank you all so much for so many questions. It's been a really good session, so thank you.
Thank you.